Due to the subject matter, we advise that children under the age of 12 or those of a sensitive nature should turn off now. Hi, and welcome to the Murder Tales podcast, where we delve into the minds and crimes of murderers and serial killers. My name is Chris Britton, and each and every episode I am joined by the criminal historian and author of the Murder Tales series of books, H.N. Lloyd, or as we know him, Lloydie.
Evening all.
You've decided to pick on a very strange case, which I actually don't remember this at all. This is one which has taken me by surprise when you mentioned about it.
This is a peculiar case that went under most people's radar. I actually wrote about it in my book, Stranger Than Fiction, because it is a series of events where when you're telling anybody about this case, they think you're balmy, you're making it up. But I promise the listeners every word that they're about to hear is true.
Okay, sounds intriguing. So, Lloydie, take it away.
Okay, well, this case centres around a guy called Peter Solheim. He was a parish councillor in a little sleepy Cornish fishing village, and he was a lifelong environmentalist. Everyone thought he was a bit of an ageing hippie with long hair. He was very, very wealthy. He was a respected pillar of the community, and he had three loves in his life. They were sex, Satanism, and boating.
Satanism?
Yeah, Satanism.
A parish councillor who's into Satanism.
Indeedy.
And here's me just thinking it was the Tories.
So, our story, it starts on Wednesday the 16th of June, way back in 2004. Solheim, he was 56. He was going out with a lady called Margaret James. They'd been going out for a number of years. They had a peculiar open relationship in the way that many people of alternative lifestyles lead. She takes Peter to a little fishing village called Myla, and she drops him off, and he says that he's going for lunch with his friend Charlie. And then he says that after he's had lunch with Charlie, he might take his little dinghy called Iswiz out to sea, then decide whether to travel over to France and spend the evening in France. 2 days later, Solheim's body was pulled out of the English Channel by two fishermen, just 5 miles south of the Lizard Peninsula, which is the most southerly point of the British Isles. The autopsy showed that he'd been dead for just a few hours, and he'd been hacked with a machete, he'd been kneecapped, he'd had his big toe cut off, he was covered in bruises, his fingers were terribly bruised, it looked like rings had been forced off his fingers. He'd also been drugged with a drug called lorazepam. They deduced that effectively, after he'd been tortured and cut up, he'd been dumped into the water, so drugged up he couldn't swim, so that he drowned. The torture that he'd undergone, they think had gone on for about 36 hours. So this was a prolonged period where this guy had been held captive and tortured. It wasn't your normal run-of-the-mill murder.
Was he reported missing beforehand?
No, he hadn't been reported missing. And when they checked up on this, the girlfriend basically said, well, I just thought he'd gone to France. And in fact, I have got text messages from him basically saying, I'm staying in France, don't worry.
See, what's interesting is the fact that where he was to where he said he was going to end up on the north coast of France. To sail the English Channel in dinghy is very, very difficult. It's known to be one of the most treacherous waterways in the world, as well as one of the busiest. So to me, that doesn't quite sound true so far, to be able to do that in a dinghy, whether you're a accomplished sailor or not.
Mm-hmm. That is true. That was the story that Margaret James gave to the police, that was the story that she stuck to.
We've now got this body which is washed up and been hacked. What we haven't established so far is who the victim was. So who was he?
Well, as I said, he's a parish councillor. He's really well respected in the area, but he is a bit of an oddball. He was the son of a Norwegian whaler and Cornish housewife. From a very young age, he had an interest in explosives, and in fact, he caused a bit of a stir when he was in his early teens, when he blew up a bridge outside of the village of Buddock. To quote one local resident, it caused a bit of a stir. In 1971, he married. The marriage wasn't very happy. In fact, his wife, Jean Dooley, later said that he had a terrible temper and a wandering eye, constantly having affairs, and the marriage ended acrimoniously. He wasn't very well liked by his own children. In fact, his children had nothing to do with him when they grew up. He also made his money by quite nefarious means. On the face of it, he was an antique dealer, specialising in firearms, but everyone knew on the side that he was a pornographer, specialising in antique pornography, bizarrely enough. And he also had this scam going, especially in the early 90s, where he told people that they could avoid tax by investing in Cornish tin mines. And it was estimated that he defrauded people of some £2 million. So even though he was, on the face of it, a pillar of the community, as they said, he was actually a bit of a Jack the Lad and a bit of a criminal. Then you get to the quite bizarre stuff, which the police discovered when they searched his house. They not only discovered boxes and boxes of hardcore pornography, they also discovered boxes of what they could only term supernatural and paranormal paraphernalia. There was jars labelled nails from coffins. There was jars labelled dust from Egyptian tombs. There was over 40 books on very esoteric, peculiar parts of Druidism and what we would term today Wicca. Jumping slightly ahead, when we got to the trial, they actually put on the stand an expert in Druidism and esoteria from Plymouth University. And let me just quote what this chap said about what Solheim had been into. So there's a chap called Ronald Hutton. He's a professor of history at Bristol University. And he said what was so remarkable about the collection of things found in Peter Solheim's attic was that it was a vast assemblage of ingredients for casting spells with almost no relevance to religion at all. It was all about power, about his ability to exert his will over others and other things. Some of the spells he was attempting to cast involved trying to seduce women, and others were trying to harm his enemies. It was very, very unusual to find someone interested in witchcraft purely as a means for personal gain and selfish reasons. I have met literally thousands of modern pagan witches, and the deceased man's trial is the first I have ever encountered that actually practiced what might be called, in old-fashioned terms, black magic.
You mentioned that he had an interest in being more powerful. Is that like a delusion of grandeur, or?
I don't think it was a delusion of grandeur with this man. I think this was a man who just liked having power over other people. This was a man who maybe did think of himself as more important and more powerful than he was. Mm-hmm. If we look at his interactions with other people as well and other druids, a lot of it was all about sex. So sex is a very powerful and motivating factor for this man. There's quotes from other druids. He was part of a druidic circle based in Cornwall that based around St. Merrin. And they basically said that it became clear that he wanted to go into areas that everyone else felt uncomfortable with. And when they said that, one of the other druids came forward and said, let me be clear what we mean by that. This guy had started to dabble with Satanism. He was starting to do satanic rituals. And those satanic rituals involved sex. And he was trying to get the other druids to take part in these sex rituals.
He generally was a true believer in it, or as you said, he had an addiction to sex. Do you think he might have been trying to use it to come up with an excuse?
I think he was a true believer. And as we'll find out a bit later, there's very clear evidence that this man was a true believer.
So let's look at the relationship with Margaret James. You said that they've been seeing each other for quite a long time.
Mm.
How did they meet? What kind of a relationship was it?
Well, he met a lot of women via Lonely Hearts columns. So for our younger listeners, before the days when you used to swipe right, you would have to actually physically buy a newspaper. You would go to the back and there would be little adverts basically saying young professional lady, 24, desires to meet, and there'd be a PO box number, and you would send a letter to that PO box number, and if they liked the sound of the letter, you would start corresponding. And that's effectively how he met a lot of his lady friends. It's certainly how he met Margaret James. She was a local widow. She was seen, like Solheim himself, as a bit of a local weirdo. She was a hippie, an old hippie. She refused to wear shoes and would always be barefoot. She was vegan before that was a fashionable thing. Her husband had died at a very, very young age in a fire in quite odd circumstances. He was a night watchman at a local mine. He was having a kip on the job, and the van he was in caught fire, and he died. The mining company gave Margaret James a very, very large payout, and she was then able to use that to buy a very desirable house in quite an exclusive area of Cornwall. So she then lived there, but the house wasn't in very good repair. This is an area where we're talking a lot of millionaires living, and they didn't like the way she kept the upkeep of the house. One neighbour described it simply as filthy. Another, who was far more disgruntled, told the local press that she kept the house as a shit tip. And they were the words that they used. So Solheim and James met via a Lonely Hearts column in 1995. The relationship was really, really tempestuous and stormy. By the end of it, they really went through sustained periods where they couldn't stand each other, and both of them would only refer to each other as it. But this didn't stop each other from basically behaviours that the board, or if not, wouldn't be classed as controlling and would nowadays counted as domestically abusive behaviours. And this was on behalf of both parties.
So you say she was married beforehand. Did she have any children, grandchildren?
Yes, she had a son. He was now growing up, and had moved out. Oh, another thing I forgot to say about Margaret James, she was a naturist. And a lot of the time she upset a lot of her neighbours by wandering around the village, going onto the local beach naked during the height of summer when there was lots of tourists about, and would draw a lot of complaints.
Okay.
So we've got two very, very odd characters at the centre of this whole drama.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So let's get to the build-up to when Peter Solheim set off in his boat. Had there been any tensions that were obvious to witnesses?
Well, yeah, he had started a quite an intense affair with a woman called Jean Knowles. Now, they had known each other since 1984, so longer than Margaret James. But the relationship had kind of heated up in the months leading up to his disappearance. Now, Jean Knowles lived in the village of St. Blasey. She was quite a woman from quite an affluent background. And Solheim had said to Jean in the weeks leading up to his death that he wanted them to be mutually exclusive, that he was going to leave Margaret James behind and enter into an exclusive, and he wanted to marry her. But he warned Jean that once Margaret James found out about this, to quote Solheim, the shit would hit the fan. So he expected there to be trouble. And lo and behold, as soon as she found out, Noel started to get malicious phone calls. She started to get hate mail. There was a whole kind of campaign of intimidation that she started to receive.
Right. So this is obviously pushing Margaret James to become the prime suspect, in effect.
Well, yeah. Well, the police initially went to where Solheim had been dropped off, but unfortunately the CCTV equipment had been removed from the local harbour. Unfortunately, a young boy had recently died in a speedboating accident, and because of that, they'd taken away the CCTV for the inquest. So on the day Sondheim had been dropped off, there was no equipment there to record it, so they couldn't prove Margaret's story. The police got it into their head, because of the dodgy things Sondheim was into, that he could have been involved in drug dealing activity, and that when he said that he was going to meet Charlie for lunch, he was actually talking about cocaine, because obviously Charlie's a slang term for cocaine. So they looked into this. They found another witness who said that Solheim had also told him that he was going to meet Charlie for lunch, but bizarrely he told this man that he now had a dodgy deal going on where he was importing machine guns into England for the black market. So that was another avenue of investigation that the police had to look down. However, one thing became apparent when they started to look at mobile phone data. Margaret James had said that she had received text messages from Sondheim saying, "I'm going to France. I'm going to, stay over there. Don't worry." When they looked at the mobile phone data, those messages had pinged off a tower, which was right behind Margaret James's house. The tower was literally just a few feet up a hill behind her house. So that led the police to surmise that Margaret had the mobile phones and had been sending the messages to herself. So the police got a search warrant for Margaret James's house and Margaret James's mother's house. During those searches, they discovered over £30,000 worth in cash that she couldn't account for. It had been removed from her bank account, but she couldn't explain why she had taken it out of her bank account. And there was also a quite angry and vile note that she'd written about Sondheim, where she'd written the kind of grammatically incorrect phrase, "what go around, come around." So she was obviously very, very angry about Peter Sondheim. And when they saw this large amount of cash hidden in the houses, they came to one conclusion: that she had hired somebody to kill Peter Sondheim, but hadn't yet paid him.
Right.
And that was what the large amount of money was for.
So let's just try and find a couple of facts. Was he out on his boat sailing by himself?
We don't know. There's no evidence that he actually got onto the boat.
So there's no witnesses of his boat being anywhere?
No, his boat simply has disappeared. There was a witness that said that they had seen Sondheim at the harbour around the time that Margaret James said she dropped him off, and he was with another man. That is the last sighting of him. It was a reliable witness, but the police could never confirm it. So they were not sure whether it could have been a case of mistaken identity.
Okay.
But that's where the trail went cold.
We've got to assume that he's either been kidnapped around about there. That man that he met with might have been the assassin, in effect.
He's been kidnapped, he's been lured there, and then he's been taken out to sea, where he's been tortured.
And dumped.
And dumped. And that is the conclusion that the police came to.
We're saying that from an emotional state, that Margaret James is the prime suspect. But you said that he was involved in a lot of dodgy deals. So is it not likely to have been some sort of criminal elements which you decided to take revenge on him?
That is a possibility. And I would have expected that is the route the police and the defence to go down. The fact that this is a man who's being systematically tortured. He's being attacked by a machete. It's almost as if somebody's been trying to get him to talk. And that is what I would think, looking at that evidence and looking at what happened to that man.
I would tend to agree, because if you think about it, if you're an assassin, do you really spend time beating somebody up or cutting them to pieces or drugging them? It's not a fail-safe way. You are torturing them for a specific reason, whether you're teaching a lesson or whether you are trying to get information. It just kind of doesn't fit on that kind of narrative. If a successful assassin would take somebody out the easiest and quickest possible way to allow them to escape.
Looking at what's happened to him, to me, there's something saying this is personal.
I agree.
If it is torture for torture's sake, then it's a personal torture, if you know what I mean.
Mm.
This isn't somebody torturing somebody for information and then dumping them off the side of the boat. This, to me, seems that it's personal, but they're dragging it out as long as possible because they estimated 36 hours that he was tortured for. That's somebody enjoying what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're enjoying seeing him in pain. So the conclusion from that is the torture has an entirely different motivation than what you would expect somebody to have been kidnapped for, or even somebody who's been paid to do the crime, unless they've been paid to torture them and somebody is watching it.
Yeah, and the other thing that you've got to highlight is the fact that she's got £30,000 worth in cash in the property. If she paid for somebody to do that, they've not been paid.
Exactly.
So what happened?
Margaret James's trial began at Truro Crown Court on Monday the 17th of April 2006. Sarah Munro QC, who prosecuted, basically said that Solheim had been murdered out of jealousy and greed. So let me give you a little quote about what she said. She said, James' plans for the future were threatened and she was at risk of losing access to Peter's money. She decided that he must die. She harboured thoughts of harming Peter for a long time, but the final straw came when he threatened to leave her for another woman. She was not prepared to lose him or access to his money. She went on after a little bit longer to conclude that this woman has a heart of stone. It's when the defence started, that's when things started to get really, really weird. And it's when the national press really sat up and paid attention. But as I said before, even though the national press sat up and paid attention, it appeared in a few articles for a day or two, and then the basically press just went, nah, this is too weird, and they stopped paying attention because what was being said in court was the type of thing that you would get in some sort of crappy 1970s horror film.
Or, if we go off today's standards, a certain tabloid newspaper which rhymes with scum.
Yeah, well, it was the type of thing that or the News of the World used to love. But effectively, Margaret James's defence, firstly, she basically said, he was my golden goose. Why would I kill my golden goose? I had nothing to gain from the murder. So far, that's pretty ordinary. But then they started to put witnesses on the stand who told this extremely lurid, and we now know completely 100% true accounts of the fact that Peter Solheim was part of a satanic child abuse ring going back possibly as far as the 1970s. 3 women eventually came forward and this was proved in a court of law. Peter Solheim, a man called Peter Petrowski, and a man called Jack Kemp were all part of this satanic child abuse ring. They would take women from local care. They would take them to local druidic sites in Cornwall, littered with stone circles, fugus and quoits. They had an old manor house that they also used, where they would take children. They dressed up as what the witnesses described as looking like Ku Klux Klan outfits, but with chains. And they would carry out satanic rituals. During these rituals, the children would be raped. When the children threatened to expose them, they lit fires and threatened to throw the children onto the fires.
This is where I get the whole true believer thing as being maybe a bit of a ruse, because they're obviously getting some sort of gratification from what they're doing. And that's why I don't feel the term true believers correct. I think that they are using it as an excuse or to take advantage.
So you're more of the opinion that it's pure disgusting child abuse, but just dressed up with funny clothing and dress up.
Yeah.
That's a perfectly valid view of it. I personally think that this man believed what he was doing, and that the disgusting acts that he carried out were an integral part of what he believed, acts that would give him more power, mystical power, if you will. Child abuse goes on, and 99.9% of child abuse isn't wrapped up with Satanism, isn't dressed up as Satanism.
No.
However, the disregarding the moral panic that there was, the satanic panic that they called it in America of the 1980s and 1990s, there is a small proportion of child abuse that is used for power and control and to control people. And I think that Solheim was part of that he believed that doing this would give him power, that it would give him a mystical power, no matter how much of a dotty belief that is. If you look historically as well, there has always been a thing where illicit sexual acts can be used to control people. And what you will find sometimes with these satanic groups, when you get young, impressionable people coming into the groups who may think, hey, this is a bit of fun, you get them into that group and then you make them do something horrific and then you can use that and hold it over them and then get them to do other things to help you. And that's how these satanic groups and networks work. It's getting people in, getting them to do something absolutely shocking and abhorrent and then go, right, we can use that, we own you now. And then you manipulate them till they get to a certain level in the organisation. Bizarrely enough, MI6 did this themselves during the Second World War. They owned a bed and breakfast where they would film individuals having sex with underage children, and they would then use those films to blackmail them in their everyday public life. They did it to certain MPs, certain people who are high up in the civil service, and they use that to control them. So this type of behaviours, however much it might shock us, goes on.
Mm-hmm. What evidence do we have that there was another person there to help commit the murder?
When the judge started summing up, Mr. Justice Cornwall, he actually instructed the jury to find Margaret James not guilty of murder. He said he would rather than find her not guilty of an alternative charge of conspiring to have Peter murdered with another unidentified person. And that's what the jury did. They found Margaret James ultimately guilty of conspiring to murder with an unidentified third party. So under the legal finding, the strictest legal letter of the law, the legal ruling is she was the mastermind. Somebody else did the murder, but we don't know who that is. And that is still the case to this day.
And still what leaves the question is the fact of, one, how it was actually committed, who committed it, and if she had paid for somebody to do it, who?
Exactly.
So with what we've established, there are plenty of suspects out there.
Exactly. Was it somebody who he'd abused? Was it somebody he's ripped off via his dodgy tin mine organisation? Was it somebody he's ripped off in some business deal, possibly a legitimate business deal? Was it somebody that he's tried to turn the evil eye on, as it were, and they haven't appreciated that? There's many, many options. He pissed off a lot of people in his life.
Sounds it.
Now, after she'd been found guilty, there was another trial, and that was the trial of the two other men who were named during Solheim's trial as being the satanic paedophiles. And those two men, bizarrely enough, they were before Mr. Justice Cottle again, same trial judge, and they were found guilty. So we can now say for some certainty, because they were found guilty in the eyes of the law, that there was a satanic paedophile ring operating in Cornwall from at least the 1970s onwards, and that there were numerous victims of this satanic paedophile ring. The law has now said that they were doing it for satanic reasons. Bizarre as that sounds.
Yeah, it does. I think morally this is a bit of a strange case, because given what he'd been involved in, you feel as though, yes, that he should have been brought to justice at some point. However, has somebody taken their own justice out on him?
I think one thing that is telling. We like to romanticize these things, and we like to think that maybe it was a victim who never saw justice, who got their own justice. But we have the evidence of that £30,000 that wasn't paid to somebody.
Yeah.
Now, if somebody wanted justice, would they be paid £30,000 to kill him? I would think that they would actually jump at the chance and would do it for free. That says to me that somebody from outside was being paid to do this murder.
What if that cash was for her to leave the country.
What, she was scared of the coven that would come after her, or something of that nature?
Well, the fact that if she had worked with somebody to eliminate him, maybe that cash was for her to do a fade.
I tend to think that Margaret James was the type of woman who actually would have expected to inherit from the will and would have hung around to see if she got something out of his will. So I don't think that was get out of jail free card money.
There's a lot of theories which can come from this now. This is just generally a strange case where I'm generally I'm trying to find some sort of explanation, and I said morally it's a strange one as well, because it's kind of like I don't feel sorry for the victim, which is terrible.
Yeah, the cases that we've focused on in the past, they've all been sympathetic victims, and I think when I try to write my books, I always try and focus a lot on the victims, make them into people, because we should never forget that this is all about the victims and it's all about that life cut short. But with this man, this is a man who spent his entire life preying on other people and vulnerable people, and making life miserable for other people, and quite a hedonistic life. So he's not a sympathetic victim at all, and I don't think you should feel bad for not feeling sorry for him.
No, I agree. It's the first one that we've come across where I'm a little bit confused at how I feel towards this, but also at the same time, it's because it's so open. This is not over. This is not finished. It's not a complete open and shut case.
No,
there's more to it.
We know who the person was behind the murder. We know who organised the murder. We know to a large extent why she organised the murder. It's just finding that other missing piece. But that other missing piece to me isn't as interesting as it is in other cases, because I just tend to feel that if they do ever find that other missing piece, it'll just be somebody who is completely uninterested and was just doing it for the money. Was an outside influence. I don't think it's going to be that romantic thing of it was a victim seeking revenge. It was an angry businessman. It's just going to be some sort of hired killer, possibly a local ne'er-do-well. I don't think there's anything. I don't think we're missing anything interesting from this case in finding that missing piece.
No. So before we go, Lloydie, any more that you want to add to this?
I think I said before that this case was taken from the book Stranger Than Fiction. So if you have enjoyed this episode and you want to know, you want more cases which are odd or peculiar or a little bit like this, please buy that book or look up that book. There's some fantastic little cases in there. There's another case of devil worship in a purely domestic, peculiar setting. Yeah, there's loads of cases in there that I think you would really enjoy.
Okay. And they're available on Amazon, aren't they?
Amazon, you can get it in ebook and paperback.
Right, okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, so if you have any questions, concerns, or any feedback, please get in contact with us by going to our Twitter page, which is at Murder Tales Pod, or you can get in contact with Lloydie directly by going to
HN Lloyd 1.
So it just leaves me to say, I've been Chris Britton, and he's been HN Lloyd.
Even and all.
If you enjoyed the show, please go onto iTunes and leave us a lovely 5-star review. And even better, click on that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. Or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. The Murder Tales podcast is based around the criminal history books by H.N. Lloyd. If you'd like to get your hands onto them, you can click on the Amazon link on our Twitter page. This show was presented, edited and produced by Chris Britton. It was created, written and co-presented by the author H.N. Lloyd. Our theme was New World Order by Neil Roberts Music. The Murder Tales podcast is part of the P Podcasting Network. You can check out our other shows such as the Pub Politics podcast, or even the Tragical History Tour. All you have to do is go and search on your favourite podcast provider.